there's another talk, and it's going to be a great one because next up we have a lightning talk from Tyriq. Tyriq is the pixel artist and game developer who worked on Cadence of a Hyrule, UFO 50. Any of y'all heard of UFO 50? Just a little game or 50 and some, who knows. And also Tyriq has his own roguelike platformer, Catacomb Kids, which is great, and co-founded Odd Object with longtime friend and collaborator Stevie. I'm sorry, I don't know how to guess the last name. Tyriq can hopefully help me there. And they're working on their first title called Scrubbin Trubble, which is a multiplayer roguelike. And so Tyriq, Stevie Hershu, thank you so much, Tyriq. And yeah, is here to talk about multiplayer roguelikes. Also, Tyriq dreams of owning a pet goat, and I really support that. So let's welcome Tyriq. Hey, welcome back. Also,
Hello.
many of the shirts we're selling you made. So
Oh yeah,
thanks
I
for
made
all
a
the cool
couple.
shirts.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Good news, everyone. I exist. And today I'm going to be talking about Scrubbin Trubble, which is the game that I'm currently working on. It is a multiplayer cooperative roguelike. I'm going to be talking specifically about the multiplayer aspects, sort of our goals setting out, some stumbling blocks on the way, and where the game currently stands. This is a lightning talk, and there's a lot to talk about, but hopefully not gonna, I'm definitely not going to be able to get to all of it, but hopefully it'll encourage some discussion and at least pique some interest. So first things first, what is Scrubbin Trubble? Scrubbin Trubble is a cooperative, multiplayer, traditional-ish roguelike, and by traditional-ish, I mean synchronous turn-based and not real-time, or turn-based in a way that makes like a big deal about whose turn it is, such as like player 1, you go now, player 2, you go now, or it's like players' turns, enemies' turns. Like no. Everything exists and operates in the same sort of modality, same space. And so the central conceit of the game is sort of an experiment to see if we can make a roguelike that still has the pacing of a traditional turn-based roguelike, but just with multiple players. The other thing that Scrubbin Trubble is Odd Object's first game as a studio. So last year, my good friend Stevie and I founded Odd Object, and we just wanted to work on something relatively straightforward that we could just use to get our feet under us and figure out how the heck a game studio even runs. For some reason, we decided to make this game. The last thing that Scrubbin Trubble is it's an evolution of a proof of concept that I made in 2020 and called Clean Sweep. And I actually gave a talk about Clean Sweep and sort of my general long-term pursuit of multiplayer roguelikes for the 2020 roguelike celebration. So if you want, you can go check out that talk. It's called Yazdari Loves Company. Don't do that now though, because that would be rude. I'm talking. Uh, and so basically to give an overview, the way that Clean Sweep worked and it handled multiplayer was that players would be able to act fully independently from other players, even in the same space, and enemies would act based on which player they're currently targeting. So if an enemy is targeting player 1, then player 2 can move as freely as they want, and that's targeting player 1 will only move when the player 1 that they're targeting also moves. And so in that way we can have multiple players and multiple enemies all coexisting in the same space, operating on their own sort of turn schedules. It was fairly fun with 2 players, but there were still a lot of uncertainty, questions that we needed to answer if we wanted to make it into a full game and expand it into something commercially viable as just a project. So things that were like questions that we would have had to answer is pretty fun with 2 players. Does it work well with 3 or more players? That's something that we did a little bit of testing on, but didn't have like a ton of like, oh yeah, it's definitely fun with 3 or more players. It's also local. The Clean Sweep was also local multiplayer only. I definitely wanted to implement online multiplayer, and I've never done netcode before, so that would be a journey. And there were just some design things that I wanted to address, such as the awkward inventory management, make it pretty with art, make it a little more marketable, that sort of thing. And so with that out of the way, this is sort of the mission that we set out for ourselves for Scrubbin Trubble. We wanted to retain turn synchronicity so that enemies and players move enemies move when players move, the world state advances when players act. But we also wanted to make it so that that players could take turns without needing to wait for other players, so that they could all sort of act on their own schedule. We also wanted to keep the game relatively snappy, especially with regards in comparison to other more traditional roguelikes, where like sometimes you got to think real hard about what you're going to do next for quite a long time, and we wanted to keep things a little more streamlined than that to keep the pace going. We wanted to have like a streamlined, easy to use interface, limited decision space so that players could sort of observe the game field and resolve their actions quickly, and have a clearly readable game state to encourage that. And also, we just wanted runs to be relatively quick. This isn't like a huge adventure game necessarily. It's really just an experiment for the mechanic itself. And to that end, we wanted to keep things relatively tight, and also just a game that people can hop in with their friends, like in the afternoon or something like that. Like, let's do a few runs and then call it a day. And to that end, we wanted to keep the playtime relatively short. And so to achieve all of those, going in, I knew that these were some things that we would need to have: small inventories, so that you wouldn't have to do any menu diving. You wouldn't be ever like overwhelmed with choice necessarily. Distinct and unique enemies for the same reason. So we don't want like a whole bunch of variants of like, oh, what does the purple version of this enemy do as opposed to the red version? All that sort of thing. We wanted so you'd be able to like take a quick look at the game state and be like, okay, I know what these things do, and I know what my choices are, and be able to execute relatively quickly to keep the game moving along. Similarly, we wanted to show threatened enemy zones, enemy actions, so that you can be able to make informed decisions quickly. Small stages with explicit goals will help sort of focus player attention, so that to encourage people sort of sticking close together and working together, as opposed to having like massive sprawling maps where players can like really go off on their own, and then it stops feeling like a multiplayer game. It starts feeling like a single player game where you might sometimes encounter another player, that sort of thing. And another thing, this is something that we didn't really learn until after we'd started working on it, but it became quickly apparent that we would have to like limit overly complex cascading effects, because otherwise that's another reason that the gameplay could really like come to a stop down really quickly, is like, oh, a bunch of stuff just happened and now we need to like parse what all of the things that just occurred, and so that can be sometimes difficult. So these were our goals going into working on Scrubbin Trubble. And so when we got to actual work, we started work in October 2024, right as Roguelike Celebration 2024 was happening, which was great, excellent, very encouraging, a lot of wonderful talks, a lot of great information. I was like, oh, this is eminently useful to the stuff we're going to be doing. One of the talks was from the Necrodancer dev about how they handled netcode for the online version of Crypt of the Necrodancer, and I was like, this is perfect. We'll just do what they did. We'll just copy exactly what they did, and everything's going to be perfectly fine. So I spent the next 2 months just banging my head against the wall trying to figure out how to do rollback code. Again, me never having done netcode before. Maybe shouldn't have done that. But it was a little tough. Ended up not working, ended up scrapping it, and realizing like, oh wait, I guess most online games don't actually need rollback. That seems like a pretty specific use case of technology for a pretty specific subset of games. I didn't know that at the time, but ended up rolling it back to now the game works sort of all entirely based in like lockstep with the server. So clients send their actions to the server and wait for confirmation from the server before actually applying their events to the game world. And everything is simulated on the client side, so the server doesn't need to like send game state or anything like that. But that does mean that it's important for us to make sure that the game itself operates in a very deterministic way. Internet turns out it's just faster than I thought it was. So after all this, we finally got the internet working, finally got the netcode working and stuff, and we essentially re-implemented the prototype of clean sweep that we had in terms of like the way multiplayer worked, and all those questions that we had. Does it work with 3 or more players? Like how to keep the pace and all that stuff up? Turns out it just didn't really work. The question, does this work with 3 or 4 players? that was one of the questions we had. The answer is no. It was too fast, too chaotic, too unpredictable. The goal was to have it be that like players would be able to cooperate with one another and slow down when they needed to on their own pace. That just wasn't a thing that happened. In order to cooperate, players needed to just basically constantly be talking and telegraphing every one of their actions, and there was a lot of like frequent toe stepping on each other's actions where like one player would move while another player was targeting an enemy that was targeting that player, and they would like go out of sync right as they confirmed their action. It was just a bit of a mess. So fortunately, due to my incredible skill of crippling self-doubt and not not believing in myself, I kind of had a feeling that this might be the case. I had a feeling that this might not work out, so I had built in sort of a contingency plan where if we needed to pivot to a different way of handling multiplayer, we could. And so I made that pivot. There was a mechanic that we had planned where players would be able to queue up actions to be executed simultaneously when another player confirmed their action. And basically we just made that be the central mechanic as opposed to it being like an auxiliary mechanic to the game. So now whenever a player queues up an action, it waits until all players within sort of the same area, within the same combat zone, also have all of their actions queued up before executing simultaneously. Like I said, I thought this might be the case. It was a relatively easy pivot to make, but there was a lot of other sort of knock-on effects that we had to deal with after that. And this also, unfortunately, sort of scrapped one of our initial major goals, which is that players will be able to take turns without needing to wait for anybody else. You definitely need to wait for other players to confirm their turns now. But you only need to do so within a limited area around you, which we call the combat zone. So combat zones are defined by like who's fighting who. So if you have a player who's in combat, or two players who are in combat with a particular enemy or whatever the case may be, those two players, as long as they're like nearby each other and fighting sort of the same enemies all mixed together, they will need to wait for each other to confirm their actions. But if there's another player who's like off in a different part of the level, who's not part of that combat, they can operate freely and don't need to wait for anybody else. They can run around and just do their own thing. And this ended up working a lot better because now players, like it really makes things easier to makes cooperation easier, because you don't need to be in the constant communication that you did before. You can just see what other players are planning to do, and you can still plan more complex scenarios, but it's a lot easier because the game automatically slows down when it makes sense to slow down. So here's like just like a little video example of the way the game works. You can see the players like moving freely at the very start, independently running around, and then once they get into combat, the game stops and waits for everybody to start to confirm their turns. And you can see here the outlined area is the defined combat zone. So any player that's outside of that area will be able to move freely of their own accord, not waiting for anybody else. So some consequences, like I said, it's easier for players to coordinate in this way. And also combat has definitive start and end points, because like when you're in combat, you can see exactly the area that you're fighting in. And when combat ends, all the guys in there are dead or whatever the case may be. That's just the end of combat, and you're free to move again, which lets us do fun things like have like little end of fight quips where it's like, oh, you got less than 10 HP left. We can pop up like a little like close call thing. Or alternatively, if you like finish an entire combat encounter without taking any damage, you get like a score bonus at the end of the level. And there are, of course, new hurdles with this, such as how do we define combat zones, and what are the edge cases, like defining all these sort of different ways, and like, okay, these players are kind of close enough. Should they be in the same combat zone, even though they're fighting different enemies and the enemies are on opposite sides of each other, and that sort of thing. Additionally, keeping the turn snappy is even more important now, because you are actually waiting for other players to finish their turns, and so we definitely don't want it to be a situation where one player is like resolving what they need to do in half a second, and another player is like really thinking about stuff for like a minute, and like basically holding up the entire combat. So the way combat zones work is players in a combat zone, if they are being targeted by any enemy, and combat zones try to involve the least amount of relevant space to the involved combatants so that they don't accidentally like draw in somebody who's not a part of that fight. So right here you can see the Bleacher, who's the white character with the hat on, is being targeted by 2 enemies, and the red border is defining the area that their combat is in. The pod person off to the left, standing next to the bomb, they're not in that fight. They can move freely right now. But then if they get into that area, now you can see that suddenly they're all in the same zone, and now the turns are being queued up and waited for, and that sort of thing. There are a couple other things that we're doing to sort of outside of this just main sort of gameplay loop that we're doing with regards to multiplayer. One of them is players vote on which stage to go to next. So the way the game works, it takes place all in the same house, and so each level you're just going from one room to another, kind of selecting which room you want to go to try and keep the grime down. I didn't mention this; it's a cleaning-based game. The theme is cleaning. You're cleaning a house, and so you're trying to keep the grime in each of these rooms of the house to a certain level, so that they don't become overrun. And between each level, you're basically voting on which stage to go to next. There's also, of course, leveling up and the different level up abilities. Some of them really lean in on the sort of synergizing of players with one another. For instance, Glistening Generosity. When you heal, your allies also heal a percentage of that amount based on the distance between you. So you might like take this level up ability and then call all your allies to come close to you before you use a healing potion on yourself, so that everybody benefits. And there's other ways of healing in the game as well, such as cleaning up certain props that you might want other players nearby for, or that sort of thing. And lastly, game overs only occur in the event of a TPK on a floor. So fallen PCs return on the next floor, but if you die, for each player that you die, it's like a really big score penalty that kind of grows exponentially. So you still want to not die, this being mostly a score-based game. But if you do die, then you can, as long as it's not a full party wipe, you'll be able to come back on the next floor and keep playing with your friends. And you can just kind of encourage them from the sidelines. You can also exit levels at any point. You don't need to like fully finish a floor. So if somebody dies and it's like, oh, I'm in a tough spot, better move on, you can just leave the level and take the score penalty, and then go to the next floor with all your friends back in action. I think I'm out of time now. That's the end of the talk. There's a lot more that I could talk about, but woo.
Good timing, Tyriq. I just sent Kawa the like. If the next slide isn't the end slide, bring me on. I got the ship stick. So, just right. Thank you. That was a lot, and definitely people, please check out. I know I saw at least one article that you'd been interviewed talking about Scrubbin Trubble. Super cool. People can ask questions. Thank you so much for packing all that into 15 fast minutes.
15 fast minutes. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Excellent.